Welcome to a new edition of the Neon Jazz interview series with jazz orchestra leader Alan Chan. He grew up in Hong Kong, made his way to New York City, and now resides in the City of Angels. Since 2011, he's been the leader of his own orchestra, and his latest album is 2014's Shrimp Tail, and many more are going to come from him. He has spent his life as a resident in various parts of the world to raise awareness of current issues like environmental protection. He's got plenty of stories and the music to back it up. Dig this interview, my friends.
Hey, Alan, again, thank you for taking some time out. It's an honor to speak with you.
Oh, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be on your show.
Right on. So I'm going to go ahead and start off here, and I know that you're real good about putting your schedule and your dates and what's going on, but in your own words, talk to me about what's going on with you.
Right now, I started teaching at the El Camino College in Torrance just about 2 years ago and directing a big band. So I'm spending a little bit more time now doing a little bit more education. And this semester, I started teaching the Survey of Jazz class. But on the other hand, I'm also working on a commission right now at this moment for the Symphonic Jazz Orchestra, which is established by George Duke. It's a 67-piece symphonic jazz orchestra. And so I'm working on this piece for their premiere this coming May 2017.
Your latest album was 2014's Shrimp Tail, correct?
Yes, correct, yes.
It's a great album. Talk to me a little bit about what went into this album and how you feel about it.
Thank you. I would say it's quite magical. I didn't anticipate. A lot of the music was written between, I think, 2005, my very first jazz big band composition, to around 2012 when I wrote Rancho Calaveras. So that was roughly 8 or 9 year period when I was studying at University of Southern California, and then I went on and moved briefly to New York. I kind of was a bi-coastal person for a while because I was studying with Jim McNeely in New York City. And so I wrote a lot of tunes while I was living in LA and then part of the time in New York. And so Shrimp Tail is sort of like the very, very first composition that I wrote. I was in LA at that time. And so I thought every piece, every song in this album is kind of like a little story because it's about different experiences that I had. I was traveling to Beijing in 2007 and noticing the very bad air pollution there. And then I wrote moving to a new capital. And I was briefly living in Altadena, California, in this very beautiful home and organic garden. So I decided, I'll write something like Rancho Calaveras. Around 2013 is when I start to put together the concept of an album. So we picked some of the pieces that I wrote, and I decided, this narrative seems to kind of work very nicely with each other. I mean, each individual, it's kind of like a big storybook, but then there's a little, episodes and different short stories. It's kind of like a compilation of short stories.
Perfect. Let me ask you this. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Hong Kong, and that was still under the British, before 1997, of course. That was the turnover to China afterwards. There is a very small, almost like a small jazz scene there. There was a club called the Jazz Club in Hong Kong, which I often would hang out. I was studying classical piano, when I was in high school, and I already got into, arranging a lot of the soundtracks or popular tunes for school ensembles. We didn't really have a music program per se. I'm sort of kind of putting whoever has the skills of playing instruments and put them together. So it's a kind of a weird mixture of different kinds of people and instruments. But then I figured out a way to kind of arrange whatever that it's in my possession. So I try to put together. Sometimes it's like 2 flutes and bass drum and piano, lots of pianists, and then all of a sudden there is an oboe, and so I have to figure something out. And that is sort of how I become very aware of my ear in terms of finding out my colors and exploring possibilities to it shows in the album the color palette that I use in this album.
Right on. Well, let me ask you about your childhood and about growing up in Hong Kong. How did you get involved with jazz initially, and were there albums or performances you saw? How did that happen?
It was a very different time. It was in the 90s. So I grew up in the 90s, and we were exposed to mostly in hanging out in record stores. It was like we have a couple of major brand names like Tower Records and HMV, and I think we even have a Virgin Mega store at one point. And so there is always the classical session, and they combine the classical and jazz together. So I was really into music of Gustav Mahler, and of course all the symphonic composers, Brahms, etc. And then I would pass by all these jazz CDs. I'm always curious about them, and so I started listening to just basically compilations of different classics. Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and then the newer ones like Weather Reports, etc. And then I kind of get into the sound of it. And we have some jazz venues in Hong Kong, so I was also able to kind of absorb a little bit of that. But it wasn't until I moved to the United States, I studied at the University of Miami, where I actually got really inspired, especially big band jazz.
When did you know that you were going to get involved with jazz? Was it something that you knew early on, or did it develop over time?
It developed over time, I would say. It's kind of, I decided for some reason, to go to, I attended American universities, and I did my master's degree, doctoral degree, all in classical composition. I have always the desire of writing jazz, but I wasn't really entirely sure. I kind of take, jazz piano lessons, and listen to a lot of CD. I have a huge collection. I have good friends that recommend me a lot of different things. Sometimes a little bit weird things like Uwe Kane. Sometimes Butch Morris. There's a variety of different kind of styles, and I was really drawn into them. I thought my career path would be just writing classical music. That's for a very, very long time. Until that is like 2005, I was at USC and studying, and I met Shelley Burke, pianist and composer. He really encouraged me to, dive into writing, and that just kind of happened. When I was in the University of Miami, I listened to, it's one of the best jazz programs in the country. I listened to a lot of big band jazz, and I also took a year, of jazz arranging there. So that also kind of started that seed a little bit, and it just gradually grows, and 2005 was the year that all just came to life.
But what was it about arranging? The piano is kind of a solitary, to a good degree, instrument. Mm-hmm. But you wanted to get involved with the big band and the arranging. I mean, that's a pretty big undertaking. What was so alluring about that for you?
I listened to a lot of, big band albums. I feel that there's a lot of potential in big band. Although we would think jazz big band is kind of a thing of the past. It's not really fashionable. It's too expensive. It's too... But I really enjoy writing for this big kind of animal and try to explore, all these little things that we have not yet explored. There's a lot of expressions, both, of course, there were composers that I listened to, like Maria Schneider and Jim McNeely and so forth. There's still a lot to do. We can do a lot of things of it. So that really is what drives me to kind of dive into writing for big band. I really enjoy working with a lot of people. I often tell my students that I'm not really good at, remembering names and so forth. But every show, we put a big band together. There's some regular members, and sometimes we have substitutes. But when I listen to each individual perform, I immediately know who they are. I finally have a context and connect with many musicians all at the same time. So it was really, to me, it's a joy.
So the orchestra comes together in 2011. Talk to me about the beginnings and the evolution to today.
As you know, I was in New York a lot at that time. I was attending the BMI Jazz Composers Workshop, and that usually takes me usually about 2 or 3 weeks, and every other month that I would basically travel to New York. And I was just freelancers and doing a lot of copying jobs, etc. I decided maybe I would start something in LA because I do have a lot of friends who is in the big band scene. I attended, I talked to a few people and said, well, yes, let's do it. And I curate a concert series at a church in West LA, and that's where we find our first venue is to do it there. We have a kind of a boutique concert series. And so we put the band together in May 2011 and kind of test it out and see what happens. And that's how we began.
Over time, you have done some work for motion pictures and TV shows, and you guys have had a lot of action. Talk to me a little bit about the projects you've worked on.
There are, of course, independent films that I have done when I was mostly around the time when I was at USC. And then right now, I am mostly doing, of course, focusing on my big band and working and collaborating with soloists, especially I started a project called Camel Walk just this year, and potentially also with a Chinese lute player, Ming Xiaofen, in New York City. I am always interested in, of course, collaborating with film makers as well as poets. I would have to say I actually have done a lot more collaboration with artists than, say, in the movie industry. I really interested in, of course, the inspiration coming from poetry and literature. And so you may see that 2 of my songs from the Streamtel, Monte Albano Solita, is actually narrations, which is kind of unusual for big band. But I kind of said, well, maybe we can try something different, and this is kind of a neat. I think that was a really neat project. We started that, the band, of course, at the first at the church, and then about 2012 we start performing outside, especially jazz clubs around town, including Typhoon and Vitello's and Catalina. It's very sad that actually Typhoon just closed their doors this week. So it's a great loss to the big band scene, but I think I feel very thankful to the people who have been supporting my music in the last couple of years.
So let me ask you this. You've been a resident around the world in various areas, and you like to raise the awareness for issues like environmental protection. Talk to me about where you've lived and what has made you want to be environmentally conscious.
I lived in Los Angeles. I kind of slowly, of course, learning about climate change and all that through the media, but also I have friends, particularly this friend who actually the owner of Rancho Calaveras. He has a solar service company, and so he put on panels and provide, electricity and hot water, etc. And I'm learning a lot more about that part, how to, conserve energy. I have to say I'm still driving my very, very old Camry at the moment, but I'm really interested to, move to perhaps an electric vehicle in the future. I have to say I grew up in the urban area, so I'm in first hand, knowing the effect of air pollution. Also, both in Hong Kong and especially Hong Kong, because Hong Kong is very highly developed commercial city. Perhaps in the 90s or in the last 6-7 years, there is also pollution coming from China. Basically, air blowing from factories right at us. So we realize, that there is a lot we have to do. And sometimes my experience that in this case in Beijing, that really inspires me to write something. And I kind of like the idea, a little bit unexpected, but I brought in a little bit of this kind of a sound of ancient China. We don't really know how ancient Chinese music sounds like, but there are some traits that I found, for example, in Japanese chord music, imperial chord music. that so you hear that really shimmering sound from the piccolo and flutes, and the kind of these two melodies kind of echoing each other. This is a very to me sounded very ancient. So I felt like I kind of juxtaposed that idea with something really bombastic, groove-based big band jazz, and so that's how the tune was put together.
You've won awards over your life. You were the winner of the 2011 Art Easy International Jazz Competition. You've gotten fellowships from ASCAP, and you've been hired to. Your works have been performed by other outfits. What surprised you the most? Not your favorite commission or your favorite award, but what one really kind of threw you off guard?
That's a very good question. I would have to say the George Strait Commission was a real surprise. Of course, Symphonic Jazz Orchestra has quite a panel of musicians that judge this competition, including Bob Minzer, Billy Charles, and Peter Erskine, etc. And I felt that it was really a recognition to me because I wasn't, I tried my own way of writing big band jazz. I wasn't really sure how other people feel about it, but when I was given this commission, I was really happy that what I've been trying to do was really was recognized by the judges. At Art Easy as well. Art Easy actually was my very first performance of my music outside of the U.S. and it was in Enschede in Netherlands, and they have this jazz festival which my piece was performed, and they were judged by a panel, and so I was really surprised. That piece was actually inspired by my life in New York. I have a little foldable bicycle that I keep. So I've been, while I was living in New York, I really take advantage of the bicycle. So you hear that clicking sound, ticka, 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 ticka in the piece, and that really is from the bicycle sound. And have a little bit of a positive tone. And I think the audience also really liked the piece. And so I was really thrilled that I received that award.
Right on. Well, speaking of getting around, you have roots here in Kansas City. Talk to me about your time at UMKC, Bobby Watson, and kind of your recollection of your time in Kansas City.
Yeah, it's I actually came and studied. That was my master's degree, and I also have to say I did a lot of things that I did not expect that I would be doing. Of course, I studied with Chen Yi. She is the Chinese-American composer. At that time, I was really trying to see what I can do as a composer, maybe bringing in different cultures together in my music. And so I decided to come and study it. And I have no idea. I ended up, of course, exploring a lot of exciting things happening in at that time in Kansas City, including attending my first burlesque show, which is in 2000. I think it was 2004. And that was just not what we think about burlesque being street teasing, but actually it was a very, very artsy kind of form of burlesque at that time. A lot of the cultural fashion designers and artists came to this one-time show in I think it was Kansas City, Kansas, just right at the border state line. Yeah. Not far from the industrial district. And I was just eyed open to see, how creative we can get. I mean, there's humor, there was chickies, but there was also fashions and a lot of interesting little skits and stories. And I also studied gamelan, Balinese gamelan music while I was in Kansas City. Cool. And that was really also a eye-opening experience, especially knowing that you can actually, learn everything, a 3-minute melody all by ear without reading any music. You just basically learn it from a teacher. The teacher tells you there's an oral tradition kind of way of communicating in this kind of form of music. In general, of course, gamelan is also orchestral music, so that also kind of reinforced my understanding of how to handle a large ensemble such as a big band.
Let me ask you this. The one thing about Kansas City is we have 18th and Vine that have a lot of history. So I want to ask you this. If you could get into a time machine and go see a show any show anywhere, where would you go? Who would you want to see?
I would totally go to, if I can see, Count Basie in his early times in Kansas City, I would totally want to go to that, I know that there's a jazz district, they revitalized it at that time, and I would very much like to, try, not only going to there to see jazz, but also, the barbecues nearby.
Oh, yeah.
That's always, it was a very different time, though. I can imagine sometimes seeing all these older buildings and what it was like, back at those days, and probably a lot more traffic and a lot more people at that time.
Absolutely, without a doubt. So let me ask you this. Everybody has a version of who you are, your family, your friends, the fans you play for, but who do you think you are? When you wake up and face the world, who are you?
I just want to be, absorbing everything, exciting things happening around me, and try to reflect on them and putting them on music paper. That's what I always wanted to do. I've been to, of course, many other cities, but also in artist residencies. Actually, recently I was in Denali National Park in Alaska. And a very, very different world, I have to say. And it was the summertime as well, so the day was very, very long. I have to kind of put on my blind when I go to sleep. But when I wake up, it's just like this is a really magical world, and I really want to go out there, hike and absorb and smell and feel and see what's going on. And I will come back to my little desk and try to reflect on that and try to create a musical piece that will perhaps inspire people to go out and absorb our surroundings.
Final question for you. Why do you love jazz?
It is the freedom. Really, that's the very first thing. I think the freedom, the boldness, the hope, and also is just it brings in a lot of people together. You think about jazz, the evolution of jazz, it's always been absorbing a lot of different cultures, Latin jazz, Brazilian jazz, even European now really dig into jazz, and Japanese. And I think very soon China will be one of those places where we'll see a lot of growth in people wanting to listen and yearning for this form, because, it's really shows, the freedom of expression through improvisation, but also just how diverse and how difficult to define what jazz is, as you know. But it's, everybody can come in different directions and try to understand in a different angle. And I think that's the openness of jazz is what I think is most amazing.
That's a great way to kind of wrap everything up. Alan, thank you for taking some time out and giving me your story and for your music.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening and tuning in to yet another Neon Jazz interview, where we give you a bit of insight into the finest players in New York, Kansas City, LA, and spots all over the world, giving fans all that jazz. And thanks to Alan for his time and his stories. If you want to hear more interviews, go to Famous Interviews with Joe Domino on the iTunes Store, or visit neonjazz at youtube.com. And for everything Neon Jazz, go to the neonjazz.blogspot.com. Until next time, enjoy the jazz, my friends.
Neon Jazz.